from today's On the Other Hand guest.
We have to be aware of how we're talking about other people to make our language use better. We have to be aware of when, oh my gosh, I was just passive aggressive towards that person. What was really going on inside of my heart to be able to change that behavior?
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Braver Angels Arkansas, where hope and common ground meet. Each episode features community leaders from Arkansas and beyond, sharing stories and insights on how together we can strengthen our relationships and our communities. In the first part of our conversation with April Chatham-Carpenter, who is the new state coordinator of Braver Angels Arkansas, April spent a little time describing for us her background in communication and how she got involved with Braver Angels. Now, let's get to this second part of our conversation with April Chatham-Carpenter.
April, you've talked about finding ways to get people together to discuss common issues. They don't need to be huge. It could be as simple as a stop sign in the right intersection. This notion of polarization, in other words, the point of departure to get together, seems like a term to me that has really come about relatively recently. Polarization to me came from the world of physics. And all of a sudden, since COVID, maybe before then, this notion of polarization has become a moniker. You have watched polarization deepen over the last several years, especially in this difficult moment in our country. Based on your experience, what have you seen actually work when it comes to communicating across deep political or cultural divides?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to say one thing about polarization. First of all, we've been polarized as a society for many years. I mean, the civil rights movement, example of that. Even back in the day, Jefferson and Hamilton were polarized. But the issue, we didn't know what to call it. Okay. Sometimes I feel like if we get more words to call something, sometimes we can actually speak something into being as well, though. And I do get concerned sometimes about so much emphasis on polarization that we begin to, oh, that's what we are. And then we're okay with it. And we just accept it as normal and the status quo. So I wanted to say that first of all. But in terms of communication, what did Hamilton and Jefferson do? Now, back then, we didn't have social media. We didn't have even the TV stations. So we had to rely on the conversations that we had. Now, Hamilton did lots of writing, as you know, and that Alexander Hamilton musical is clearly seen. But we had to rely on writing or we had to rely on conversations. Well, they also relied on duels if they didn't really agree, but we're not going to go there. Okay, so when I think about that kind of what I have found to be effective, it is my willingness to lean into the discomfort of getting to know another person's perspective. And let me just give you a couple of examples of that, okay? And these are both family examples. My first one I've mentioned before in other examples, I think maybe even on this podcast in another example, but I don't know that I identified who it was at that point because she was still living. My sister passed away a couple of years ago, 2 years in the summer. In the 2016 election between Clinton and Trump, I did not like either one of the candidates. So I chose, even though people told me that I was going to throw my vote away, I chose to vote independent. Now, I'm not going to tell you who I voted for, but character was hugely important for me. And I saw Trump as not being the kind of ethical person that I thought we needed as president. And I saw Clinton's record and I was like, I don't know if I can support that as a conservative. All right. So now I have to decide what I'm going to do. I am a citizen. I am going to vote. Well, so I don't know that I may have told my husband, I think but I didn't blast that out. I wasn't advocating. Voting is a very personal thing. I don't think we need to tell people who we're voting for. I don't think it helps us necessarily. Because it's a personal thing when you go into the voting booth and it's supposed to be private. And sometimes I don't know who I'm going to vote for until I get in there and I'm praying and I'm like, God, please help me. But I remember my sister being such a Trump supporter, and I was like, here she is, one of the most godliest women I had ever known, followed her faith in Jesus so fully. How in the world could she go and be supportive of Trump? And I didn't want to have the conversation. I would see her posting things on Facebook, and John, I would block her for 30 days. I couldn't stand it. It would make me so angry. I'm like, she's just reposting things, and I don't even think some of them necessarily were true. And this is right kind of at the beginning of where we were kind of distinguishing between misinformation and disinformation. And so people weren't really thinking about that. It's just like, you read something and you repost it. And anyway, I finally decided I'm in this Braver Angels organization. Dang it. I'm teaching my students how to have one-to-one conversations. I need to have a one-to-one conversation with her. I didn't end up using the guide that now I would highly recommend, and we'll probably get to that as a recommendation later from Braver Angels, because I didn't want it to look strategic and scripted. Having our hands open in front of us is a physical reminder that we are there to listen, not to advocate for our side. So my goal was truly to listen to her. So when she told me and she started telling me the reasons, all of a sudden I'm like, I understand that. I might needed to clarify something, so I'd ask a question that was a clarification question, and I understood that. She almost persuaded me after the fact that I should have voted for Trump. Almost. Okay. And so that's how open I was to even having my mind changed. It's basically leaning into the discomfort and hearing their story, hearing the story of what led them from point A to point B and not judging it. And that's so hard with people that disagree with us. So I think about the labels that we place on people and the fact that in these days, conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, just pick the two major parties, when they're running in the primaries, have got to speak to the most extreme portion of their base. And what that makes it look like in a state like Arkansas or any place else is that they are more extreme than they really necessarily are in order to win the primaries. And now that the Republicans in the state of Arkansas have said that you have to be Republican to actually be in the primaries. And I understand actually more about that, but I'll come back to the ranked choice voting. But I think about if we knew there was ranked choice voting, we could actually have a platform that is more true to our personal and community and state values than the platform that might be expected from the current leader in the White House, Republican or Democrat, okay? Or our most extreme part of our base. Now, why would conservatives be against that? Since I'm not against it, I'm only guessing, okay? Because I've not had a conversation with a conservative that's against it that has told me, and that would only be one data point anyway. So I'm only guessing it is the fear of losing power, okay? So anytime we approach something as a zero-sum game, and what I mean by that, I was talking to somebody about something at my university that I feel like is turning into this zero-sum game, is that if you win, I lose. If I win, you lose. We are seeing ourselves as adversarial immediately. We're not seeing ourselves as being able to work together at all. So if I see elections and the other side as being, again, so other than me that I can't even work with them, why would I want ranked choice voting to allow people to go towards the middle, which I think most of the people in our country are? middle right or middle left or independent. So I've got to now not speak to my base. I've got to speak to my base, which is the most vocal. Okay. And I might get criticized and be called in the Conservative Party a rhino, Republican in name only. The problem with that is that nobody knows who a Republican is anymore because the Republican Party has changed so much.
Well, April, when you think of Arkansas specifically, what kinds of divides concern you most now? Not just political, but maybe social concerns, cultural concerns as they relate to Arkansas.
Oh, we have lots. We have the rural versus urban divide. And that some of these other divides that I'm talking about actually relate to that, right? So education divide as well. People who maybe only have had high school education and people who have college education. There's an elite kind of feeling and system sometimes that brings if you have college. And I'm a college educator, so I'm not speaking against college education, but I'm just saying that it does create a divide. We have a huge socioeconomic divide in this state. We have the haves and the have-nots. That's not different. These three things are not different than any other state. Okay. Probably. We have huge racial divides. Okay. The history of our state, with what happened with desegregation, still is present. There are still some communities, I think, where people of color cannot walk down the street and feel extremely safe. There are also faith divides. I still remember when my mom we would drive by on the way to church, by at one particular church, not going to mention the church name, especially since I'm going to be working with the church stuff, potentially as state coordinator. But she was like, oh, those people aren't even Christian. I'm like, that's what I believed. If I believe they're not Christians, then I'm also doing othering, right? Right? If that's my justification for whether I should talk to them or not. There also is, in the education arena, there's the public school versus the private school divide. So when we do social comparison, we almost always are either putting ourselves above another, or in some cases, we're putting ourselves below another, right? And that's the self-esteem, some of the things that happen with our young people who, are starting to post these beautiful pictures of themselves, or you see somebody on vacation and you're like, I wish I could go on a vacation like that. So you could kind of feel bad about yourself. So but it never levels us out.
So given that you believe individuals and small groups, maybe neighborhood groups, can work together, find the differences, sort them out, but also find the commonality. Are there roles that institutions in Arkansas can play, universities, nonprofits, maybe faith communities, to reduce polarization, or is it an individual, not a large group solution?
Both and actually, this is another one of the things that I love about Maury's, the new CEO's approach to Braver Angels, is that he sees there is a personal thing, right? I mean, we have a whole workshop called Depolarizing Within. I just moderated a national one of those last weekend. And so we have to be aware of our biases to confront them. We have to be aware of how we're talking about other people to make our language use better. We have to be aware of when, oh my gosh, I was just passive aggressive towards that person. What was really going on inside of my heart to be able to change that behavior? Okay. So I have to be aware of that. Personal is always going to be a part. That's always an individual part. But there are places I think that institutions can help us. And a lot of times it's simple as sponsoring a book read on, like, Monica Guzman's I Never Thought of That This Way book, or sponsoring civil conversations in a community, like Hot Springs or Monticello or someplace. Or maybe it's we're doing a church actually did what my church did, had my husband and I lead a book study on a book that was a religious kind of focus, but taking called A Gentle Answer, where it was during the time that we were really divided as a country before the Trump second presidency. But I mean, where I guess we're really divided now, but taking having opportunities for people to talk to each other. For me, at my institution, my department, as I began to be part of Braver Angels in Arkansas, I said, should we have a class that students could take that would be an elective class? It wouldn't be required, but it could be taken either that class or conflict management, because it seems like that there's some overlap there, obviously. So I created a class that we offer every fall semester, undergraduate and / graduate class, called Listening and Civil Dialogue. And sometimes we can do things like that, right? And I make a real effort to bring in approximately equal examples of conservative and liberal viewpoints and have representation from ideological diversity as well as cultural diversity, okay? Because I want students, and in Little Rock, UA Little Rock, we have a lot of persons of color. So I want students to be able to see themselves in the people that they're hearing, as well as not just me as a white woman. Okay, so when I think about is it individual, is it local, is it national? It's got to be all three. It's personal, it's community. That's the reason why we are trying to do things in Braver Angels in Arkansas and set up these local community groups, which Braver Angels calls alliances. I don't know why they came up with that name as opposed to chapters. It seems like chapters would be just as fine, but anyway, they call it alliances. Okay, so we can act together. We can learn to talk and practice the skills in maybe a place that, oh, you know what, you just said that and that kind of irritated me. Can we do that over? Or that I really love how you said that. And we can actually kind of, get better together. That's part of the community, but it's also finding things we can work on, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of finding solutions. But then national level, I mean, there's some people that need to run for office, that, maybe they need to be part of national initiatives. That, I mean, right now in Braver Angels, we have this national level Citizens Immigration Initiative. There's a more fancy title. But they are going in and having community groups and state groups, and I would love to have some of these in Arkansas convened, community common ground workshops about immigration. And then what they're going to be doing is they've had over 100 of these, I think, so far. They're putting together all the results of them into this national level. This is what we think could be done nationally. And so sometimes we can even work things from local state levels up to national recommendations. So I think it has to be all of those.
Well, sticking with Arkansas for just the moment, we talked about the inclusion of universities or nonprofits or even for-profit organizations being a part of this conversation. Do you feel that it's possible and maybe even appropriate for our political, civic, religious leaders here in Arkansas to take a hold of this and make it a topic of conversation?
Yes, and I think we need to be willing to recognize that our group by itself doesn't have the bandwidth to solve the whole problem. So sometimes we can get into, and I'm not talking about just Braver Angels, I'm talking about any kind of nonprofit. Sometimes we can get into it's my group, so let us take the lead and get the accolades for it out there, that we forget that there are other people that have common values. They may be across the political aisle or a different kind of religious background that could actually help us with this. And so I really, really encourage us, as we see issues, and especially with the nonprofit level, to work together. The governor right now is working on a 1033 initiative that is bringing together churches and social service agencies to try to help people who are experiencing extreme poverty. I don't know if that initiative it's being piloted right now, will get off the ground, or if it'll just be in word only, but it's trying to build community connections at local and state levels to make it easier for people to get the help that they need. And that's an example of working. I know it's difficult sometimes as churches, especially, to think about, okay, can I even work with the state? Because we've got this, church state kind of, rule that you can't get money as a church if you are getting money from the state. I mean, we dealt with that with COVID, right? It's like, okay, so we're getting money for that. Are we going to lose our nonprofit status and so on? But this is an attempt to actually help us see what resources are available on both ends of the spectrum and work together.
Okay, I will add one point to what you're saying. When it comes to the leaders of various entities and participating in the work to bring people together and to solve problems, I think it's really important that everyone in the leadership role think about what model they are portraying to people at large. And that includes things like starting with positive messages and basically saying, here's what I believe would be a good idea that would be helpful, as opposed to starting off with criticisms of bad stuff. There may be there may be room for criticism, but start off with the positive and end with a positive. Put the emphasis on that. It also includes not calling names. We have gotten into such a name calling habit in our country everywhere. So for leaders, being careful not to call names.
I think about back to Aristotle, logos, pathos, and ethos. We teach this in our classes in the communication discipline because people can make arguments with, logical arguments. They can tell stories that move people's emotions. That's the pathos. And they need to be credible as a speaker. Okay. So if a leader, and I don't care who they are, Glenn, I'm not going to name names here, but we can all think of people in our lives who have been credible leaders at work and people in our lives who have been real rascals. Okay. But they still were in leadership position. Oftentimes I see people in the organizational environment that sometimes it seems like they get taken out of a position and then they get promoted into another position rather than firing them. And they're just being a rascal there too. Okay. So they're missing the credibility. I think we have to have all of those to have good leadership. Speaking logically, thinking about, using good information, emotionally, not just crawling on the emotions of the people and that we're talking to and heartstrings. Emotions, emotional appeals can be used in very uncredible ways, and just as logical appeals can be too, actually, because people can, take facts and use them in statistics and use them in ways that are not ethical. But credibility is one that we overlook sometimes.
We hope you enjoyed part 2 of today's conversation. If you liked what you heard, share the episode with a friend.
Thanks for joining us for this second part of today's conversation with April Chatham-Carpenter. We hope April's story gave you a little bit more hope and a reminder that we can, together, do good things. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels Arkansas, a community of citizens working together to bridge the partisan divide and build a stronger, more connected Arkansas.
Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
I'm your host, Glenn White.
And John O'Brien.
Join us in working to make our relationships and communities better.